You're listening to the Mannin Line. With me in the studio is Tim Graham from the Manx Wildlife Trust, and also from the Trust is Lara Howe. They were our guests on Sunday Opinion when we were talking about some of the work and issues surrounding the Manx Wildlife Trust. They're here now to talk to you instead of talking to me. So let me remind you once more, 66 13 68 is the telephone number. You can text to 166177, or you can go to studio@manxradio.com. We were talking, when we went into it, talking about birds in general and seabirds before we did it, Lara. We do have, I gather, quite a diversity of seabirds here. Are they like in some countries at risk?
Yes. Sadly, I think we are having issues with some of our seabirds declining in numbers for various reasons. Around our shores as well as further afield.
All right, so what's the cause of that?
Oh, lots of reasons. Possibly predation of eggs.
By what, animals or people?
Well, possibly both, but I think in some cases it's more animals. So hedgehogs, I know we talked about them earlier, and but also longtails. But also possibly due to a lack of food availability now. I know there's been lots of discussions in the press about loss of sand eels and things like that, which many of our seabirds feed on. So that's also a possible issue.
Right. So it's quite a mixed bag, really, in this sense, isn't it? It's a very difficult thing to fix if it's so wide and varied.
It is very difficult, and it is a global problem that we all need to work together on solving. You can't just do it in isolation.
Interesting question here just come in from the first of our correspondents, Tim. I live in Kirkmichael, and I found a couple of wallabies in my garden. What type of food do they like?
That's a very good question, because it'd be something we want to find out more about. What are they eating all through the year? Because obviously they're eating different things all through the year. A bit like hares, it's probably going to be some of the young shoot. If it's in your garden, there's probably a lot of things that they're actually eating and nibbling on. It's depending where they are, that they can adapt and eat a lot of things. So if you've got flowers, it might be some young buds and shoots linked to the trees a little. It's quite a varied diet. So one thing we did manage to confirm, because there was a research student that did it, was that they weren't eating the orchids at Close Sartfield, because that was one of the questions I remember that had been always niggling around. But it wasn't them; it was the hares that were eating them.
Well, hares, rabbits as well. They come in your garden and eat everything, don't you? If they can
depending how they're doing, it can be it's a very mixed blessing as well. How many of the animals are grazing? So it can be positive on one side, too many, and it goes negative.
I haven't seen so many rabbits lately around about. I mean, there was, again, up in the countryside 2 years ago, there were some of them in the field next to us, and we noticed that some of them looked pretty ropey, and now there's none there. Is this myxomatosis still about?
It's something we sometimes get, ask questions or get it reported to us, in terms of somebody will see them with the sort of weeping eyes and things. We might get a photo emailed in and the question asked. It's not something that I've actually heard. It usually comes in, but I have heard that there's in some areas there's more rabbits now, so I wonder whether they're actually recovering after.
Well, they tend to be sickly, and they tend to be quite tough. And there's some even got their burrow just outside the station here.
I could imagine. Yeah.
This morning on the news, Howard says that on the internet I read there's a pod of killer whales quite a way up the Clyde River, as far as near Greenock.
Yes, I vaguely read a bit about this morning. Actually, one of the ladies we were out walking looking for birds this morning mentioned it. Yeah, so that's really nice to see. Quite unusual, but it's good to see.
Yeah, but that comes back to my question about changing the area, because they're not common for the British Isles, are they?
They're being seen more and more off Shetland and sort of the north of Scotland and places like that quite regularly now. But further south you don't tend to see them.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reports about the population and impacts. They're not necessarily being able to breed as successfully in the British Isles, so it's something for us to think about.
Right, well, we got our first caller on the line, and I'm sure you know this gentleman, John Dog Collister. Good afternoon to you, John.
That's am I. I worked for the museum for about 5 or 6 years, and I'm well known for my knowledge about the curragh and what goes on. All the time I've been out there, I've found, particularly, say in the winter time, if a tree or a branch would come down, the bark would be took off it. Probably, I always said wallaby height, about 3 foot off the ground. All the bark would be stripped off it. So in the winter time, where there's not much about, they'll definitely eat bark. And in the summertime, again, if a tree fell over, all the greenery would be took off it, and again, all the bark would be took off it.
Right. So they like that, but they don't chew anything else of the tree then.
Well, I'm certain they'll eat other greenery, but I'm just throwing that in. I don't know what everything else they'll eat. There's all sorts of stuff out there that they can be eaten, but I can't say that I've seen them eating this, that, or the other. But I do know, and I can say categorically, that they will eat the bark off trees and tree. You do see trees in the summertime grow, and the lower parts of these have all been kind of nibbled off. So I think trees and leaves and so on play a big part in their diet.
Have you any idea how many of them are up around the curraghs?
Oh, there's a scotch of them. And out there, when you're out wandering around, arguably you don't see them that often. I think they hear you coming, and they disappear. But I've seen as many as 13 or 14
really?
in a boat when I've been out there. Yeah,
they're definitely coming on close Sartfield and things. They're not bothered about people at all now.
Yeah, well, they are getting less scared, frightened. When you're out there, I find that there's runs, as I call it, a bit like a rabbit run. When we used to go setting loops for rabbits, you would look for a run, and you see runs all over the place, and droppings. That's the best way. That's a good way of describing it. Droppings all over the place. So there's either one doing a lot, or there's a scutch of them, as I was saying before.
Well, in the fine weather, I can imagine that's not too bad. What do they do in the foul winter weather like we've just had?
Well, it's surprising. They'll just make the best of it. I know in the curragh, particularly over nearest to Sulby end, I'd be out wandering sometimes, and there's goats up the Sulby Glen on the hillside, and I've seen goats out in the curragh in the winter time. So it's hard for the goats up on the top, and they migrate down into the curragh. So there must be stuff that they can eat that's growing there all the time.
Are these wild goats?
These are wild goats, like out in Bulgham.
Right.
Well, I know. I know
Pardon?
Personally, goats will eat bark and all sorts of things off the trees, because we lost all our fruit trees when the goats got out at home when I was a kid. So I would definitely say that they'll eat a lot of the bark. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you'll see, as I said before, in the winter time, particularly if there's a branch come down where the bark is softer. You know what I mean? They'll probably not eat so much of the bottom bark of a tree, because it's probably harder to eat than now. But when you get a branch come down in a storm, or a tree come down in a storm, definitely it would be all grazed on, and it would just be bare twigs.
So we've got wild wallabies, wild goats. What else have we got of significant size in wild animals around your neck of the
probably wild farmers wherever the goats and and the wallabies are. They've obviously escaped from the curragh. I think 1963 or 65, somewhere around with that. They escaped, and literally the curragh was a good spot for them, because they got no problems with people interfering with them. They just bred. They do have problems though, interbreeding and so on. You do find blind ones out there, and they seem to manage. They probably. It's like everybody else. And when people, if they go blind, their other senses come to the fore. Right. Hearing and smell.
Well, they're surviving then.
Out there.
They're surviving, obviously, with that disability.
Yeah, I worked, as I said, I used to occasionally come on them, and I've caught them a couple of times, and I took them to Ballaugh School, or I took one to Ballaugh School, and we had like a whole class afternoon, a couple of hours. I brought it in a sack, and I got it out and it was sitting on my knee, and the teacher did a whole lesson on the Southern Hemisphere. What's the capital of Australia, and what's another animal that related to a wallaby, and all sorts. What's the capital of Australia? Yeah, all sorts of different questions asked based on the fact that there was a wallaby sitting on my knee. And the second one I brought, unbeknown to me, there was a joey in the pouch. And I'm sitting there with this thing sitting on my knee. Next minute, the whole class went ballistic in front of me, and I wondered what the heck is going on. And anyway, I glanced down, and there's a little pink, they've no fur on them, little pink head out skeeting down and then back down inside. So then they all had to have a look at the little, they all had to look at the baby. I'm going to do a willow down at Glen Willen here, and I've got a scutch of people that's wanting to help me, so I better go.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us, John.
Well, I hope it's been helpful anyway.
Yeah, John, thank you. Thanks again.
Shade of A.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye. There we are. That was John Doghoster. I bet you've met up with John a few times before.
Yep.
Yes, well, there we are. That's an interesting thing, of course. He's talking about wild goats. We didn't get into that at all before. And, of course, there was all the fuss about the goats out the other side of Laxey, wasn't there, at Balaric? What, as far as other wild animals, with your wildlife trust, do you see those as domestic animals that have just gone feral, or do you actually take them into your scope as a wild animal?
Well, that's quite an interesting one for us to try and get around. There's a lot of views just amongst the Wildlife Trust, in fact. But what we try and understand is, one, well, what's the source of them? You know, are they escaped and feral? And then also what kind of impact they're having. So a lot of that's about, well, what kind of conservation impact are they having? Is there obviously a direct impact on some other sensitive species and things? So we wouldn't necessarily consider them part of the native ecosystem and what we were looking to recover, but it doesn't necessarily mean to say that we'd say, you know, it needed action. We want to know what actual harm they were causing before we would actually be advocating.
Wallabies are vegetarian, are they?
Yes, yeah, and then it's about, well, have they had an impact on the rest of the vegetation in the Curragh area and things like that? So that's something we're working with others to try and get some more numbers and actually a better understanding around.
And he says to supplement food bank offerings, there's lots of food for free. I don't know if he's talking about people or he's talking about, reading this about animals now. Lots of food for free, wild garlic, young hawthorn leaves, besides rabbits. And then he says, are hedgehogs protected, or can you eat them? Well, are they protected, by the way?
That's a good question. I don't think hedgehogs are actually protected. I know one of the theories about exactly how they've come to Ireland, whether there's supplementary introductions and things, is the fact that they used to be carried on ships and things potentially as a food source historically. That was somebody at the museum that told me that. So that's an interesting one. Obviously, it's not something that we're advocating in terms of eating hedgehogs and things, but foraging is one of the things that's been really growing on Ireland, and obviously that done sensitively, like many of the people are taking, you know, lots of the guided walks out. That's exactly what they're advocating, and that's a great way of interacting as long as it's sensitively done.
I don't know whether this is the case, but my grandfather, we're going back quite a way now, he used to do that. He used to go out and come in with all sorts of stuff. He said the countryside's full of food if you know where to look for it.
Absolutely, and it still is in surprising places sometimes as well. And obviously there's other things that's starting to come through. You know, people are really enjoying making elderflower cordial and things like that. You know, it's really coming back quite strongly as well.
As there have been changes in the wildlife through evolution, through the ages, and promoting one species can often reduce another, so isn't it best to be all left alone and let nature take its course?
Oh, this is a question that often comes up. The big thing is we've had a massive impact on the ecosystems around us, not just because we call them semi-natural habitats and the like, which sort of gives an indication of how culturally impacted they are, the fact that we've been managing them for so long, but also we've now got to the stage where we're actually having to take specific actions that encourages species back. We mentioned curlew in the programme before, and actually taking action. We're not necessarily going to be able to just get them back by leaving them alone. So we've got to make a choice. What do we need to take active interventions on and really help to come back? to the point where in the future, hopefully, we can just leave it to manage itself because the processes are there. So that's the kind of philosophy we're looking to actually introduce. Sometimes it might be important, or so important, that actually we specifically got to manage an area to make sure that that species survives. And there's always a balance, should we sit and watch some species go extinct on Ireland, or should we take action? And then there's a whole brand of philosophy that's sort of looking at, well, what do these new species bring with them? Is it positive when we think about climate change and how big an effect that's going to have over the next 50 years? It's quite a big time for these massive conversations in conservation.
Survival of the fittest, though. It's a pretty good natural principle, isn't it?
It is. It's about what's actually going to be fittest and most adapted to its situation. Now, the problem is that we're constantly changing that situation.
This is
and
humans.
Actually, do they have time to evolve anymore? That's one of the big questions we're trying to get to grips with.
Okay.
And we know then many species won't even be able to move as climate changes. So will we have to step in and move some of those species?
Robin Peel says we still have foxes on the island. They first appeared at Santon Plantation 25 years ago.
So there's a big story about the foxes on Ireland, as I understand it. Only having been here for 2 years,
Well,
I've only been
They did appear for a short while, I think,
Yeah.
but I think they were fairly quickly removed, I
Yes,
thought.
and it keeps coming up. So, there's stories about people actually specifically bringing them over. The big thing would be if they were successfully breeding and very viable, everybody would be hearing the vixens. It's unmistakable hearing the banshee call of vixens. So if it was a significant population, we would really, really know about it.
People would be seeing them a lot more
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Definitely.
We live in Smale in Andreas, and in February I met a wallaby on the road one evening when coming home, and I know neighbours have seen and encountered them, and I've seen some evidence that there's been at least one in our garden, says Marie. So that's somebody else who's seen them in the north again. But you said they're moving south.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of records of them all across the island. So they're obviously very capable of dispersing across the island. It's about where they're really breeding. It's still obviously very concentrated around the Currachs. They're very successful, and I think Paige Haviland's research said there was about 120 of them around there in terms of the population. So that's a lot.
Quite a lot from 2, isn't it?
It certainly is. So it makes you think that there's a number of escape events, perhaps some intermingling going in and out of the wildlife park and the like. And then somebody, maybe was it Doug, that mentioned the fact that you can sometimes see the diseases, that some are blind, things like that. Well, that seems to have shifted a little. Perhaps there's a few more sightings now that there's been some disease, the effect of inbreeding, and a few years ago there seemed to be less reports.
Right. Well,
Fewer.
those are the now. Those of you listening, let me remind you that this is the Mannin Line, so we'd appreciate hearing from you by telephone on 66 1368. You can text us on 166 177, or you can email to studio@manxradio.com. We'll take a short break now, and we'll be back in a few minutes.